Hello again, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be finishing up the major arguments in favor of voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. In the last lecture, we looked at arguments 1 through 3 listed here. We're going to spend a little more time on 3, and then primarily in this lecture, look at argument 4, which claims the distinction between active and passive euthanasia isn't morally relevant. 5, the denial of the slippery slope will save until later when we inspect directly the slippery slope arguments against euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. But for now, let's jump in and continue our discussion of 3. Remember, Dan Brock claimed that almost everybody supports voluntary passive euthanasia. And the reasons they support voluntary passive euthanasia are reasons of autonomy and well-being. Right? People have a right to self-determination. They get to choose when they die, and they can calculate that their lives are no longer worth living, and we have a duty of beneficence to help them. And so all these things seem to justify voluntary passive euthanasia. But Brock claims, look, all of those same reasons apply to cases of voluntary active euthanasia. Once again, with voluntary active euthanasia, the person is exercising their right to die. They're calculating their life is no longer worth living, and we could have a duty of beneficence to help them. So if you believe voluntary passive euthanasia is permissible, and most people do believe that, then they should also believe that voluntary active euthanasia is permissible. So Brock is trying to say here, look, if you want to be a consistent, rational thinker, and you find voluntary passive euthanasia permissible, you should think the same thing about voluntary active euthanasia. But many have responded to Brock or these types of arguments by saying, look, you're right. Those reasons do support both voluntary passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. But Brock, you're forgetting about these additional morally relevant differences between the two. Right? The same reasons support them both, but there are extra reasons against active euthanasia which don't apply to passive euthanasia. And primarily here, people want to say, look, killing is always wrong. Letting someone die is not. And so in cases of active euthanasia here, we're killing somebody. And so that's always going to be wrong. That's an additional morally relevant factor that Brock wasn't thinking about. Whereas in passive euthanasia, we're just letting somebody die. And we're letting somebody die from a terminal illness that was already going to kill them anyway. So that's morally permissible. We can let someone die. We just can't kill them. And so just to make it a little bit clearer, in voluntary active euthanasia, the doctor is causing the death of the patient. At least that's what they claim, right? The doctor is causing the death of the patient because they come up and they give them an injection and they die, right? They wouldn't have died without that injection, at least not for a while. The injection literally kills them. In passive euthanasia, the claim is the doctor's not causing the death. The illness is causing the death. Right, so this illness is killing this person. It's going to cause the death. And in passive euthanasia, the doctor's just letting it happen at the patient's request. So they say to Brock, remember, you got the argument almost right. The reasons support both passive and active euthanasia, but you forgot that in active euthanasia, there's this moral difference between killing and letting die, and killing is always wrong. Okay, so now on to the major argument for today's lecture. And that's whether or not this distinction between killing and letting die is actually morally relevant, right? So for the sake of argument, everybody says, yeah, sure. There's a different cause of death in each of these cases, right? The doctor is directly causing it or indirectly causing it by letting the person die. There is sort of a metaphysical or causal distinction to make, right? It's not that killing and letting die are literally the same action. Sure, there's a distinction in the action. But, and here's the important part, there's no morally relevant distinction to be made here, right? They're both different actions, but the moral evaluation is the same. So, probably the most famous proponent of this idea that the distinction is not morally relevant comes from James Rachels, who you read this week. And so he has sort of two major arguments against the relevance of this distinction. And the first comes when he's talking about babies with intestinal blockages. So some babies who are born with Down syndrome are also born with intestinal blockages. And without operation, the intestinal blockage will end up killing the baby, right? Operation is necessary on the intestine to save the baby's life. Now, some people make the decision there to not operate and let the baby die, right? So it's not killing, it's just letting the baby die. But Rachel says, look, here we end up in this really weird situation. Now we're going to have this baby sort of slowly wither away from dehydration and infection over a number of days, when we could just end that suffering immediately with a quick injection, right? So here he's saying, look, the difference between passive and active, right? Passive seems to actually be more cruel. You're going to watch this thing wither away and suffer, whereas active would just cause the suffering to end immediately. And we're going to have the same result in the end either way, right? The baby's going to die. So why not just end the suffering as fast as you could? And so Rachel's is asking us here, which is more cruel, right? Letting the baby die over time or killing it immediately? I assume most of us share the intuition that letting the baby die is more cruel in this case. And if that's the case, then passive euthanasia isn't at least clearly on morally better grounds than active euthanasia. People said active euthanasia is worse because it's an act of killing, and killing is always wrong. But being cruel is also morally wrong. And it seems like passive euthanasia can multiply or like allow greater cruelty into the world than active euthanasia could. So, I mean, if you think passive euthanasia is permissible, then at least in cases like the suffering babies, you should think active euthanasia is permissible. It's less cruel. So this is just Rachel saying, look, you thought passive euthanasia was on morally better grounds than active euthanasia, but at least in some cases, it's clearly not. Now, here comes his major argument against the moral relevance of the distinction. And this is his famous case of Smith and Jones. Because you have two people, both in very similar situations. Smith stands to gain. Gain in the form of an inheritance if anything were to happen to his 6-year-old cousin. And so one night, his 6-year-old cousin is in the bath, and Jones sneaks in and drowns his 6-year-old cousin. Holds his head under the water and drowns him, and then makes it look like an accident. And his intention with all of this is to kill his cousin in a way that he can get his inheritance. Now, Jones is in a similar situation, right? Jones stands to gain from an inheritance. His 6-year-old cousin's in the bath, but there's one difference. Jones is sneaking in with the intention to drown his cousin, the same way Smith was. But as he's approaching, the child slips, hits his head, and lands face down in the water. And Jones sees the child drowning, and Jones is ready to run in, right? So if the 6-year-old started to stand up and recover, Jones would run in and continue to drown him so that he could make it look like an accident and end up getting the inheritance. But fortunately for Jones, the 6-year-old never recovers, ends up drowning all by himself, and Jones is able to just sit by and let his cousin die. So Rachel wants to say, look, these cases are exactly the same, except for one difference. Smith killed the child. Jones let the child die. So we have the distinction people are calling for. But now Rachel wants to say, look, this distinction just isn't morally relevant. Neither of these people behaved any better morally, right? Smith and Jones are each equally blameworthy for these actions, right? We should shame them for these actions equally. Right? Even though Smith did the direct killing and Jones just let the child die, they both intended for their cousin to die for their own gain, so on and so forth, right? If there were really a morally relevant difference between the two, between killing and letting die, then our reaction to these cases should be that Jones is less reprehensible than Smith. But that seems false, right? In both of these cases, these men are greatly reprehensible, right? So although Jones just sat by and let the child die, I mean, he sat there and watched his cousin die and was ready to drown him should the child have started to recover. So it seems like both are equally reprehensible. And that means that this distinction between killing and letting die isn't morally relevant. And then Rachel's wants to say, look, the reason why we think there's a difference in most cases is because we're used to seeing killing attached to some negative intentions, right? So Smith has evil intentions. Jones has evil intentions. But doctors just let people die out of compassion, right? So Rachel's wants to claim that, look, the reason why we think there's this great distinction is just because there's always some additional morally relevant stuff. It's not the difference between killing and letting die, right? When we see an act of killing, it's normally accompanied by evil intentions. When we see an act of letting die, normally it's accompanied by something like compassion. So the distinction isn't morally relevant. The reason why we think it might be morally relevant is because we're confusing it with all this other morally relevant stuff. Okay, so against Rachel's, Daniel Callahan has had some things to say. Callahan believes the distinction between killing and letting die is morally relevant. And one of the reasons he believes the distinction is morally relevant is because he thinks the cause of death is morally relevant. So he thinks killing and letting die are only equivalent when we confuse the causes of death. Particularly in cases of letting die, the underlying disease causes the death. In cases of killing, the action of a person, namely the doctor, causes the death. And he uses this little case here at line 2. Right? So if you unplug the machines on a healthy person, they still live. If you unplug the machines on an unhealthy person, they die. Right? There's a difference there. But if you give a lethal injection to both a healthy or an unhealthy person, they both die. Right? So the cause there is slightly different. A person is causing both to die, whereas in letting die, there's a disease or underlying issue that's causing the person to die. Now, you might respond to Callahan and say, look, Callahan, I agree with you that there is a causal difference, right? One is a disease causing death. One is a person causing death. But we're not worried about the causal status here. We're worried about the moral status, right? So they can have different causes, but that doesn't mean that they're morally different. In fact, if what Rachel's was saying in the case of Smith and Jones is right, it seems we have good reason to believe they're not morally different. Callahan also has this sort of second case, which I think is a little bit stronger. He says, look, we judge different cases of omission or letting die differently. So think of a doctor who is in a case of voluntary passive euthanasia. They just let them die because they request it, and the patient was going to die anyway. But on the other hand, we have doctors who don't provide a treatment that they should have provided, right? Their omission lets a person die from a disease, but their omission is sort of negligent or based in their ignorance of proper treatment, so on and so forth. And so both of these are acts of omission. Both doctors are omitting treatment. But in the first case of passive euthanasia, we say that's letting die. In the second case, where the doctor's negligent, we label it as killing. And so he thinks there's got to be something different, right? There's got to be something morally important about the cause of the death. But once again, I think Callahan is probably mistaken here, and we can go back to Rachel's to explain why this is. Callahan's cases of the negligent doctor and the passive euthanasia doctor is another case in which something else is really doing the moral work. It's not this idea between killing and letting die. Really, in the first case, it's the negligence, right? The doctor is failing the duties of his position. He's doing something morally wrong. He has a duty to save these patients when they request it, and he's failing. In the second case, the doctor is actually showing compassion for the patient. He sees that the patient is suffering and wants to respect their wishes about how to end their lives. Right, so once again, seems like the moral difference isn't coming from the distinction. It's like Rachel said, it's coming from other factors. So there we have our case against the moral relevance of the distinction between killing and letting die. Now we're going to go on and look at the arguments against voluntary active euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Thank you.